The scream had long since faded, swallowed by the desert wind, but the pain still clung to her like a second skin. Ilara lay in the dust where the night had left her, the earth dry and unforgiving beneath her trembling body. Her face was streaked with dirt, her lips split, her eyes hollow from hunger and heartbreak. She could taste blood, bitter and hot, where his hand had struck her. The man who'd sworn to protect her had ridden off into the dark, taking her horse, her purse, and every ounce of mercy she had ever believed in. The dawn came cruel, bleeding gold across the endless horizon. The sun didn't care that she was broken. It simply rose, burning the memory of her suffering into the sand. Her stomach twisted in protest, empty for days. Her throat was raw, every breath a scrape of pain. She thought of water and felt her mind drift toward madness. But the desert wasn't a place for the weak, and she had already learned what weakness cost. In the distance, something small glimmered, a shadow, half buried under sand. She blinked against the light until its shape formed. An old cabin, tilted and forgotten, the wood gray from years of sun. It looked like salvation dressed in ruin. Ilara crawled toward it, her fingers clawing through grit. Every inch she moved was a war. When she reached the door, she fell against it, too weak to knock. The sound of her body hitting the wood was the only prayer she had left. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of dust and ghosts. Sunlight pierced through cracks in the roof, catching the particles that drifted like slow snow. The silence was so deep it hurt her ears. She dragged herself across the floor until she reached the shadow of a broken table. The boards beneath her were cool and splintered, but she no longer cared. She pressed her cheek to the wood, whispering to no one. Her voice cracked, more breath than sound, as she begged the emptiness to take her pain away. But the desert doesn't take. It waits. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had stopped keeping count for her. When she opened her eyes again, her vision blurred. She thought she saw movement at the doorway, a shadow tall and still against the blinding light. Her heart stuttered. She couldn't tell if it was death come to finish what life had started, or something else entirely. The figure stepped inside. Heavy boots on old wood. A man, the kind the land forged, broad, worn, silent. His clothes spoke of years under the sun. His eyes carried storms. His name was Coulter Vance, and though she didn't know it yet, he was the kind of man whose past bled through everything he touched. He stood in that doorway a long while, staring at the woman collapsed before him. This was a cabin he'd sworn never to see again, the place that had buried his heart a decade ago. Every boy remembered the night his wife died in his arms, their child still and breathless beside her. He had left this place to rot along with his grief. But something, a pull he couldn't name, had brought him back today. And now, fate had laid another broken soul at his feet. He knelt, slow, careful, as if touching a ghost might make it disappear. Her skin was pale beneath the bruises, her body shaking from fever and fear. She tried to open her eyes, tried to speak, but no sound came. He lifted her gently, as though afraid the wind itself might tear her apart. And for the first time in years, he felt his heart remember how to ache. Outside, the horizon blazed. The world went on turning. But for Coulter and Ilara, something had shifted. Two lives scarred by loss had collided, and the desert, silent witness to their ruin, held its breath. When Ilara awoke, the air smelled of smoke and rain. Her body lay beneath a coarse blanket, soft enough to remind her she was still alive. The light in the room had changed. It was warmer, softer, the kind of light that meant someone had cared enough to tend a fire. She turned her head slowly. The cabin that had once been hollow now carried the quiet sounds of life, the pop of burning wood, the faint scrape of metal, the steady rhythm of breath not her own. Coulter sat by the stove, sleeves rolled up, bandaging his forearm where a splintered glass had torn the skin. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, like a man who knew pain too well to flinch at it anymore. For a long moment, he didn't look her way. Maybe he thought she was still dreaming. But he felt her eyes on him, and when he finally turned, there was something in his face that made her chest tighten. Not pity, not desire, but understanding. A silent recognition between the broken. Days passed like that, slow and heavy as summer dust. She healed inch by inch, fed by small bowls of broth and the quiet rhythm of his care. Neither spoke much. There was no need. Words couldn't rebuild what the world had already burned down. Instead, their silence became a language of its own. The clink of tin cups, the soft thud of boots by the door, the creak of old wood at night. In that stillness, something fragile began to grow. Coulter had lived with ghosts for too long. Every night before Alara came, he'd sit by the fire, staring into flames that flickered like memory. He'd built fences around his grief, so high that nothing human could climb them. But now, there was a second cup on the table, a blanket folded beside another bedroll. The cabin, once a tomb of sorrow, began to sound like a home again. Sometimes, when the evening turned gold and the wind brushed soft the grass, he'd catch himself watching her as she walked outside, barefoot, cautious, tracing the world as if learning to live inside it again. The bruises on her skin had faded, but the ones inside her lingered. He could see it in the way she held her shoulders, as if expecting another blow from life at any moment. She didn't speak of the man who left her in the desert, and he didn't ask. The land had its own way of erasing names that didn't deserve to be remembered. Still, the past never truly disappears out here. It waits, just beyond the horizon, quiet and cruel. Coulter knew that, so he fixed the roof, mended the corral, and cleaned his old shotgun. Not because he expected trouble, but because the desert had taught him to. He had spent years avoiding the weight of his memories, but now he had something fragile to lose again, and that frightened him more than any outlaw ever could. At night, the two of them sat near the fire. Sometimes she would fall asleep in the chair, her head tilted toward the flames, her hands still clasped in her lap. Coulter would watch the rise and fall of her breath, that small rhythm of life he'd thought he'd never want near him again. And though he didn't touch her, didn't speak, a strange peace filled the room. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but from finally letting something new exist beside the pain. The days stretched into weeks. The color returned to her face. Her steps grew sure again. She helped to mend the fences, gather firewood, and patch the worn clothes that hung by the door. Sometimes she even laughed, a quiet, uncertain sound that caught him off guard every time. It reminded him of what it felt like to belong, and he found himself wishing the sound would never stop. But in every fragile joy there's a shadow. Alara could feel it sometimes. The pull of something coming, the echo of her name whispered by the wind. And Coulter felt it too, that shift in the air, the way animals went still before a storm. The land had gone quiet again, and quiet in these parts was never a good sign. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Coulter stood at the edge of his porch and watched the light fade. He thought of his wife, of the years he'd spent trying to bury her memory beneath hard work and silence. And he thought of the woman now sleeping inside his cabin, whose strength reminded him of the same kind of courage his wife once carried. The kind that keeps breathing, even when life won't let you. He realized then that the desert had given him back something he didn't think he deserved, a reason to stay. But as the wind began to rise, carry with it the scent of dust and something darker, he knew peace was just another word the West liked to break. The wind changed the night before it happened. It came low and mean across the plains, whispering through the grass like the voice of a memory that refused to die. Alara felt it before she heard it. The shift in the air, the stillness of the animals, the heavy pause before something awful. And somewhere inside her, something old and frightened began to stir again. Coulter was out near the corral, checking the horses when he saw the first shadow move. It wasn't the kind the moon made. It was darker, heavier, carrying the weight of a man's hate. Then another shadow followed. Two riders. Their silhouettes flickered at the fence line, quiet and slow. He didn't need names to know who they were. The past had finally found its way home. He blew out the lamp inside the cabin and waited, his breath steady, his hands calm. He'd spent years learning how to stand his ground. The war inside him had never really ended. It had just gone quiet. Now, as the desert night thickened, that war rose again, not out of anger, but out of the promise he'd made himself. No more running. No more losing. The first man called out, his voice cruel and familiar. It carried through the dark like poison. Alara heard it and froze. The sound of his drawl turned her blood to ice. She didn't need to see his face to know it was him, the one who had left her broken in the dirt, the one she had sworn she would never hear again. Coulter moved forward, each step slow and deliberate. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stood there in the moonlight, his shadow tall against the cabin wall, the weight of the land behind him. The desert had taken everything from him once, and he wasn't about to let it take her too. The men dismounted, boots in the dust, knives glinting under the pale sky. The world seemed to narrow into that single stretch of dirt between them, the quiet before a storm that no one could stop. When they came for her, Coulter didn't think. He moved like the land itself had willed him to, solid, merciless, certain. The fight was fast and ugly, all sound and shadow. The knife flashed, the shotgun swung. The silence broke with a crack that echoed for miles. Blood hit the dirt. Pain tore through him, hot and sharp, but he didn't fall. Not until it was done. When the dust settled, the men were on the ground, their hate silenced by the very earth they had mocked. The neighbors came with lanterns, the sheriff with his weary eyes. He saw the blood, the knife, the truth written in the dirt. There were no questions, no need for words. Some things in the West still understood justice. By the time dawn came, the bodies were gone, the light pale and cold. Ilera sat by Coulter's side, her hands shaking as she cleaned the cut on his arm. He didn't flinch. He just watched her, quiet, the firelight catching the lines on his face, the scars of a man who finally stopped running from ghosts. When she finished, she looked at him, and something in her chest broke and healed all at once. She realized then that survival wasn't about escaping death. It was about finding something or someone worth living for. The days after were soft in a way neither of them trusted. The land smelled of rain, the fields green again. Ilera worked beside him, her hands stronger, her steps steady. They rebuilt the fence together, the same one broken by the men who came for her. It stood straighter now, tighter, like it knew its purpose. Sometime, in the quiet of dusk, she watched Coulter sitting on the porch, the horizon painting him in gold. He'd rest his good arm on his knee, hat low over his eyes, and for the first time since she met him, there was peace in his face. Not the kind born of forgetting, but of finally forgiving the world for what it took. One afternoon, he led her back to that old cabin, the place where he'd first found her. The door still hung crooked. The air still carried the memory of ghosts. He stood there for a long time, looking at the walls that had once held his grief. Then he placed his hand on the frame, and his voice came low and rough. "This place doesn't belong to sorrow anymore," he said. He didn't need to say more. She understood. They began to rebuild. The broken windows were replaced, the floor mended, the roof patched. Every board carried the mark of their hands. Every nail driven into it felt like a prayer answered, and slowly, the house became something new, a home, born not of perfection, but of persistence. At sunset, the land turned copper and soft. Ilera stood outside, the wind tangling her hair, her eyes full of light. She thought of who she'd been, the girl left for dead in the sand, and who she had become, a woman who had stood back up again and again, until life had no choice but to take her seriously. Coulter watched her from the porch. There was no grand moment, no words of confession, just two souls breathing the same air, alive after everything that tried to end them. Sometimes that's the only kind of love the West allows, quiet, earned, and unspoken. The nights grew gentler after that. The sound of the windmill turning became a comfort instead of a warning. And for the first time in a long time, when the wind swept over the land, it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like peace, because the desert, cruel as it was, had taught them its final lesson. That strength isn't in the fight, or the fury, or the fire. It's in the getting back up. It's in the choosing to stay. It's in finding warmth where the world once left you cold. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the earth met the sky, the ghosts of what they'd lost finally rested. The land was quiet again, but this time the quiet meant they had survived.